Hello, welcome to Aerospace Corporation's Space Policy Show. I'm Colleen Stover with the Center for Space Policy and Strategy. I'm very excited to announce that we're kicking off a 6-part season on contested space. We've got some great discussions lined up. We'll be looking at the theory of war and deterrence, cyber warfare, the physics of defending in space, the workforce, and even the entrance of commercial actors. Today's episode is the kickoff. It's about the strategies employed by the United States Space Force at the operational level to deter and respond to war, possibly extending into space. Our first guest is Lieutenant General DeAnna Burt. She's the Chief Operations Officer of the United States Space Force. She'll be talking to our own Jean Michael, General Manager of the Strategic Space Operations in Colorado Springs. Now, I have to offer a disclaimer for our YouTube viewers on this show. I promise you that the General is not recording from the moon. In fact, she's in the depths of the Pentagon. So our video team has worked tirelessly to make adjustments to the video, but it does have a number of anomalies. So we hope you understand. So thank you to the General for joining us. Jean, take it away.
Thank you, Colleen. General Burt, I'm so pleased to be able to speak with you today. I'd like to open up and give you an opportunity to talk about yourself, your career, and how the Space Force is going forward.
Thanks, Jean. As you mentioned, Lieutenant General DeAnna Burt, I've been a space operator for 32 years, both serving 28 years in the Air Force before coming over to the United States Space Force. It's been an honor and a privilege to serve our nation. I am currently the Chief Operations Officer here at the United States Space Force headquarters in the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. What that means as Chief Operating Officer is that I am in charge. I'm the Deputy Chief of Operations for operations, cyber, nuclear, for the Chief of Space Operations here, the 4-star, who is our Service Chief, General Saltzman. So work on his staff every day and integrate and work to provide operations support across the enterprise to our 3 field commands and down to our deltas. So it's been a great opportunity, never a shortage or dull moment as you stand up a new service, very exciting every day, and also have the opportunity and pleasure as the COO to also participate in op steps or operational deputies meetings on the joint staff in conjunction with the tanks. So I think all of the 4-star service chiefs meeting with the chairman as General Saltzman's, as the chief attends as his +1. So I've seen not only the service side operations, but also the voice for operations into the joint staff processes and infrastructure working alongside General Saltzman. So it's been a great honor to do that.
Great. Can you talk at all about what you've done in your career that's prepared you for this role?
I've had a lot of interesting opportunities over the course of my career, and I would say I'm an operator at heart. If you look at my record, I've largely done operational and command tours throughout. This is my first time in the Pentagon, so it is been a very much a learning experience at this level. But operations is operations, and bringing it to this level and having discussions of trying to explain what the Space Force brings to the fight, how we integrate, and how we best resource and operate is what I see as my prime support to the boss every day. How we continue to educate and work as a service and establishing how we operate in that infrastructure is important. I would say that the biggest parts of my career, I think that were really important for me, was going downrange to U.S. European Command, to be in the COCOM, in the Joint Theater right after 9/11. So that was an opportunity to see how we would support cross COCOM to CENTCOM as we went into Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom, both of those operations from being downrange and supporting them from US UCOM. Time at weapons school, SAS, education opportunities throughout my career have also helped me kind of put together doctrinally, being able to stand up a service and what that means. So again, I think it's rhyme or reason and the opportunities you're given, and do you take them? But I think my joint time working with the field and being an operator at heart and being truly in this business since I entered the Air Force in 1991 has helped me see the history and the shape and where we've come from our first space war in Desert Storm to now where we are today with the fight going on in Ukraine, and how critical space is to that operation. I think it's important. So that depth of experience has been very helpful for me.
That's good. So you talked about the normalization of space, the role, the example in Ukraine. Do you think there's been recognition really of the change from space as a capability provider to space as a warfighting domain?
Absolutely. I think Ukraine has exhibited that space is absolutely a part of modern warfare. All our potential adversaries are looking at how do they incorporate space into what they do. And they not only do they have to have it, do they have to buy it, have it indigenously within their own military, they're also able to now get that commercially as well. And as we've seen with Ukraine, one of the very first targets as the salvos opened that the Russians went after was a cyberspace attack against commercial satellite communications that the Ukrainians were using. So it's evident they understand the importance of how space connects the joint force, how it pulls capability together and allows you to synchronize on the battle space and to precisely target. And so I think the Russians have been jamming radars, GPS, and SATCOM throughout the conflict. So the Russians understand its use, and they want to take that away from their adversary, the Ukrainians, in order to be successful. So I don't think that's going to be anything different moving forward. I think for us as the United States Air Force and Space Force or United States military, I think the most important piece here is how do we bring as a United States Space Force, bring space superiority to the joint force? And that requires us to continue to provide world-class capabilities on navigation and timing, satellite communications, and missile warning to the joint force to enable them to connect and fight as efficiently and as lethally as possible. Secondly, we've got to be able to defend those capabilities because our threats from China and Russia are coming on orbit, and therefore we've got to be able to protect those assets every day and to fight through attacks either terrestrially or in space in order to defend them and to keep them available. And lastly, we also have to protect the joint force from space-enabled attacks. So that means ISR and other space-enabled capabilities on the enemy side. How do we remove those capabilities to protect the joint force so they can continue to operate and do what they need to do as well? So I do see in the future, how do we do that responsibly? In our competitive endurance strategy, we don't want to see a war that extends into space, but should it, we need to be able to do responsible counter space campaigning. How do we make sure we responsibly eliminate threats, not only to our space capabilities, but to the joint force when required, but do that in a responsible way, not to trash the domain or to fratricide or affect others that operate in the domain day to day. So I think the shift is happening. You hear the discussions here on the joint staff, and as we do operational planning and standing up components in the theater, we're starting to hear more and more of that discussion, and I think folks understand the importance. It's now how do we synchronize and command and control those capabilities in order to move forward in a joint coalition and commercial fashion.
That's great. And you mentioned General Saltzman. He's been very clear about the priorities for the Space Force, a ready, resilient, combat credible force. Can you talk a little bit about, from your operations perspective, the role of STARCOM and the role of the operational test and training infrastructure that they're putting together to bring those guardians to just what you mentioned?
No, I agree, Gina. It's critical what STARCOM, Space Training and Readiness Command, is doing. We have to have an ability to train our operators with a live environment, a virtual environment, or a constructive environment. So the LVC is what we refer to that as. How we're trying to incorporate that is in our FY24 budget proposal. We have $340 million assigned in order to go after what we call the National Space Test and Training Center. So think of it very similarly to the National Test and Training Range at Nellis on the air domain side. How do we build a similar architecture that incorporates both that live, virtual, and constructive capability for our operators to train? And that's fully employed with operators to act as aggressors, both as the humans in the loop, flying those capabilities, and whether those are done live, virtual, or constructive. How do you have that thinking adversary throughout all of your training events on the range? And so that's the goal of where we're headed for, and will get us to that combat ready force that we need so that they are prepared to fight through and win should a war extend into space.
Great, thank you. So can you talk about the U.S. fights wars with others, a team sport, if you will? Can you talk about the roles of the joint force of our allies and even in commercial in those kinds of work that the Space Force is doing?
It's absolutely team sport with all three of those players that you mentioned. First, with the joint force, we are part of the joint force. And it is critical to understand that a war that extends into space doesn't just require answers in the space domain or to respond in the space domain. We would respond in kind in any of the domains in order to fight that left of launch or to keep those capabilities, threat capabilities from launching, or cyber, or working other kinetic capabilities in other domains. So it's not just, I want to be clear, it's not just about how we fight things in the space domain, it's how we fight as a joint force, and we go to war as a joint force every day. The second partner you mentioned is our coalition, and we cannot do it without them. And we've seen that just as in every other domain, we need to fight as a collective. How do we collectively build tactics, techniques, and procedures? How do we collectively operate day in and day out, shoulder to shoulder at many of our units where we have coalition partners, for example, in missile warning? How do we collectively make sure that we are sharing information and we're passing messaging on information and intelligence and sharing of information? So I think all of those things, operating a collective with our partners in the space domain, just like we do in every other domain, is crucial going forward for us to be successful as a nation. And lastly, I would say the third partner is commercial, but just as important, to have the industrial base in order to sustain the Space Force and where we are going. We have seen a tremendous capability brought in commercial launch, and we've seen, we expect here in the next few years that we're going to see launch increase 300%. With that, to be able to do that, we're going to need that commercial industrial base to do that launch capability for us and to assist in that increase in ops tempo. That also is important as we build satellite capabilities, the actual buses themselves, and all of the interconnectivity to make all of that happen. To be able to be resilient requires us to be able to have an disaggregated architecture that would be involved in the commercial side as well as the partner side with hosted payloads, and putting them on a variety of capabilities for resiliency. So it make it very difficult for the enemy to hit us in one place and be able to take out a lot of capabilities. We've seen in the past, we've built exquisite capabilities. We could take out one, it would definitely impact our capabilities. As we move forward with our architectures, we're looking to aggregate them both with partners and commercial industry to be able to spread that capability more, such that it's more difficult to take down a capability and we could fight through an attack and respond in kind as needed based on direction from the president.
That's great. So sort of following on from that, United States Space Command and its leadership has recently been very clear about their need as the COCOM for space warfighting for what they're calling dynamic space operations, sustained maneuver in a military sense. Can you talk about the Space Force's response to that as the force provider in the domain?
No, absolutely. I think the service and the COCOM are working hand in hand on this concept of dynamic space operations. How would we service vehicles and provide expendables on board? So think gas. How would you continue to lengthen the life? So therefore, you are not limited by maneuver in your gas tank if you were able to do refueling. I think in some operations, particularly as we talk going to the moon and beyond, gas is an absolute must-have. But even in GEO and in geosynchronous orbit and in, I think we're starting to see this as a concern of how we could do refueling. Also, how do you replenish and very quickly? So we go to responsive launch. And how would I have capabilities and payloads available to quickly launch and put those back on orbit? So all of those things are being worked within the service. And how do we create, I know Space Launch Delta 45, General Purdy's been working both servicing and responsive launch out of Space Systems Command for some time now. And we're working through various industry days and how we would enable that both from our launch ranges as well as from our commercial and partner providers of how we would be able to put those capabilities together to respond. So I think we are working with the COCOM. Our operational imperatives for the future talk to these capabilities. And I think we're working toward how do we palm and fund for them in the future.
Thanks for that, General Burt. I'd like to follow up a little bit about the role of command and control, or C2, and how that is needed and what is needed to support that in space.
Great question, Jean. I think first and foremost, we have to be able to communicate not only with the combatant commands, as we started to stand up our service components. So we have Indo-PACOM, CENTCOM, and U.S. Forces Korea. We are on the cusp of standing up U.S. European Command's service component and many more to follow. But those service components give us the direct line as a service component to work the initial part of that C2. What does the COCOM need from the service working back to get those capabilities available to the combatant command as to fight with the rest of the joint force in that area of responsibility? We'll have a service component presented to United States Space Command, which is also working how directly to the COCOM that works the area of responsibility of space from 100 kilometers to infinity, and how are they managing that in the domain on behalf of U.S. Space Command. So you have both the geographic combatant commands, C2 elements, feeding back what are their requirements. You have within the U.S. Space Command, combatant command primarily for the area of responsibility. Additionally, you're going to have C2 going on between the commercial and coalition partners. So with the coalition partners, what I mean by that is the other space operations centers with our allies. So think the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia. Daily, the Combined Space Operations Center at Vandenberg is talking to those op centers as well to coordinate across how we do C2 with our allies and partners as well. And then from a commercial perspective, you have two different centers, but we're working very hard on are the commercial integration cell there at Vandenberg at the Combined Space Operations Center with our 10 partners who work there and are integrating every day, as well as the Joint Commercial Office working primarily space domain awareness, working out of the National Space Defense Center in Del 15 out in Colorado Springs. Both of those trying to leverage commercial capabilities to the best of our abilities in real time as we're doing operations in the domain. So I think overall C2, as we talked earlier, it's a team sport in space. So therefore, the C2 element has to be created to talk to all of those elements. And in that team sport, we talked about the joint force. So again, those service components act as an inject into that joint force in each of the COCOMs, but also here in the headquarters and here in our command center, how we are working with the National Command Center here in the Pentagon to also relay space information to the joint staff up to the SecDef. So I think across the board, that team sport of joint, ally, and commercial all have to be tied together in a C2 architecture as well. As we work to the future, JADC2, Joint Air All Domain Command and Control, Space Force is very much engaged in that. And how will we do that in a contested environment? We are obviously very big contributors with the Space Development Agency as we start to work through the space data transport layer and how that will connect as a key component of the JADC2 network. So to your point, C2 is critical. We've got to do it at all echelons. And as we continue to move forward, it's got to get more machine to machine and turn much faster than we do today.
That's great. You mentioned the 45th. Can you speak a little bit more about the role of the deltas and how they will be integrated going forward, not only within the Space Force, but in that joint force you mentioned?
So a delta for us is the equivalent of a wing command in our former structure in the Air Force. And so the deltas are purely mission focused and working on a particular, so think satellite communications and navigation and timing, missile warning, orbital warfare, space electronic warfare. In the case of SLD 45 and SLD 30, they are both launch deltas, space launch deltas. But Space Launch Delta 45 has also been given the responsibility of going after the servicing discussion, on-orbit servicing, as you discussed, responsive launch, and how they would get after that. And again, the launch range there has had an incredible tempo and pace at Patrick Space Force Base for the last few years. And again, we see that continuing to ramp up. So the deltas are very mission focused and reach forward into their field commands or their major command equivalents up to the service staff to be fully empowered to talk about what are the resourcing they need, what are the innovative ideas they're trying to execute, And how do they then work forward through their field command to the service to get the resources that they need to execute that? But we want to empower, as the Space Force, the lowest level. The intent is to push as much responsibility to the lowest level to be able to move as quickly as we can to respond at the time and place for the need of what we need for space capabilities.
Great. General Burt, the Space Force will be taking over the JTAG's mission from the Army in FY24. What does that imply for how missile warning is provided to the theater and other joint fighters?
Gene, it's an awesome responsibility, because I think now you're going to put all of missile warning under a singular service. So therefore, all the capabilities will be connected, funded, processed under a single service. So as long as we execute our FY24 budget submission, you will see JTAGs fully transition and move over as of 1 October. The key parts of this is, I think you recognize that both our 2nd Space Warning Squadron there at Buckley Space Force Base operates on the Space-Based Infrared System, or SBIRS, capabilities, and has a Block 20 configuration for their ground system. JTAGs also operates on the Space-Based Infrared System as well. And then there's an instantiation that the Army was managing for that program for the software to continue to be upgraded and managed. So now when you put those under a single service, when we start to talk about how we manage it, it makes it a lot simpler, for example, to ensure those software upgrades are done in a timely manner and together. It also allows us to look at TTPs and ways we could share information across the two services. Now they're in one service. To do better. Also, when we talk about talent management of the personnel and how we can trade folks forward and back now within the Space Force itself, both working at the ground station where they're looking at the entire SBIRS constellation versus being downrange and only looking at the limited number of satellites directed over a specific theater. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here to help. We have 5 sites that we will take on, 4 OCONUS, 1 CONUS location, as well as the production center out at Redstone Arsenal. So we have locations in Italy, Japan, Korea, and Qatar for those JTAGs units. And so again, having those feelers out in the theater, again, working with the service components in the theaters as well. I think we're only going to continue to improve our capabilities of missile warning and what we are providing to the combatant commanders now with a united front, with all of those missile warning capabilities being under a singular service.
That's great. So pivoting just slightly, the Aerospace Corporation is spearheading a first-of-its-kind effort, Space Workforce 2030, which gets at improving the diversity and representation within the entirety of the space enterprise. And at the moment, that's a joint effort with others in industry, and all have agreed to have Aerospace integrate and represent the data to get after further transparency. Can you speak at all about how the Space Force is approaching that problem set with recruitment and training and retention of its guardians?
No, agree. And it's an important topic, especially in today's age of a digital service and innovation that's required for where we're going, because a lot of the technologies and capabilities we're talking about are on the cusp of development. So it requires a really technical yet diverse team to get after solving some of the hard problems we're moving forward as a nation, as well as in the space domain itself. It's a really exciting time. So you need the right personalities. So we talk about recruiting in the Space Force, a small service. So right now we have more applicants than we can choose from. So we are being very discerning and picky in our in what we are asking for from the folks that we are bringing into the service. So we have that luxury. I would say that we continue to work through retention will be a concern moving forward, making sure we retain those guardians once brought on. But how do you create that diverse force such that they are able to operate at their full capacity and be able to explore ideas and thoughts, which gets to our 4 core values: character, connectedness, commitment, and courage. How do I use all 4 of those C's to enable diverse thought, innovation, and teamwork? Using those, especially, again, new environment, you're going to have a lot of courage to push the status quo. Connectedness, we need them to talk together and working in teams. We already talked about earlier what a team sport this is. We need to be connected. absolutely, you have to have the right character and ability to serve our nation and wear our nation's cloth. And then the commitment, again, we want them to feel committed to this, that they understand they're serving for a greater good, not only to defend the nation, but as we begin to build in this journey of a new service. It's pretty exciting across the board. Lastly, we're also looking, as we talk about retention, some other opportunities as we talk about the Space Force Talent Management Act that's currently working its way through Congress, and we're hopeful will be signed in the next NDAA that comes out of Congress. This would allow us to have both part-time and full-time jobs within the Space Force, within the Title X authority, which would help us as folks need to in periods of their life, whether that to be go back to school, to do education within industry, or to take a hiatus for whatever reason, or to have a child, that would give them the opportunity to go part-time and continue to serve within the Space Force, but then come back full-time later. So those are the opportunities I think we're moving forward and looking at differently than some of the other services as we move forward to best improve and get the best guardians that we need to do the job on behalf of the nation.
That's excellent. I think that part-time come and go perspective could be very helpful. That happens a lot in industry. So it would be wonderful for the Space Force to spearhead that even across the other services as well. So General, going back to the personnel and the people, because that's ultimately what we can all provide to the nation. Can you speak more about what are the attributes that the Space Force is looking for in Guardians?
Absolutely. We're looking for STEM degrees, science, technology, engineering, or math. This is a highly technical business, so having those, it's not everyone must have a STEM degree, but that does help your chances for selection. Obviously, we're looking for a diverse group of backgrounds and experiences, along with gender, ethnicity, of how we pull together a team that is multifaceted and available to do the job. A vision for curiosity. We just finished up recently the academy applications to come into the Space Force. So they apply in their junior year, and then they're notified toward the end of their junior year that as they go into their junior year, they learn what was selected. And so we just worked through those interviews. I had the privilege to do those. And I would tell you, it's interesting. You can see people with a passion for space. I grew up with that same experience living in Florida on the Space Coast and living and watching as I grew up the shuttle program and where we've come. So that desire to be in space, to do something different, to recognize the future and where we're headed. I mean, that excitement, you can see that in a candidate as we do the interviews, and as part of this process, as we make selections, we are doing interviews. And because we're small enough, we have the luxury to be able to do those. But you can absolutely see someone who is really excited about doing this versus someone who is not. It's also really easy to see, again, they've got the background, they've been doing space clubs, they've been researching and doing different things. So we're looking for those backgrounds and experiences that are going to bring added value to our team and work together well.
That's fabulous. I think one of the best things about the Space Force is reigniting the passion that you and I, as you mentioned, grew up with, of watching the early space program and bringing that sense of adventure back, as well as the reality of space as being a warfighting domain. Do you sense any hesitance from the nation or those applicants with that new reality as space as a warfighting domain rather than a place of exploration?
No, there's always a tension there. And I think no one wants, as I said earlier, no one wants to see space as a warfighting domain. That's not good for any of us. And it's always amazing to see the things that NASA and other organizations, as they go out and study the Earth and beyond and what's out there, it's always amazing to see. So that exploration absolutely is what I think captures the nation. But I think at the same time, what we all need to understand is the freedom to do that is not free. And the ability to protect and defend and allow those things to happen. We want it to be free and fair for all. How do we create the norms of behavior and the opportunities for every nation who wants to do that, to be able to do that along the lines of norms of behavior that we can all collectively agree to? I think that's what's important, and why a service is needed to ensure that we can support that moving forward. And if folks don't want to operate that way and we are forced to fight, that we're prepared to do so and defend not only our explorers and the folks that go out there, but what we've got to do every day to support the joint fight here on Earth.
Can you comment at all about that, the normalization, if you will, of the Space Force within the Pentagon, within the US government, the domain and the new reality that we face?
I think the National Space Council is doing great work leading this effort on norms of behaviors, not only for the nation, but externally. This is largely working. We saw the State Department just release their framework on space and how do we have those dialogues and start to talk about that. I think those are all important because that's where that needs to reside. The role of the military, unfortunately, we have been the lead player for many years in the domain. That is now flipped, and there are more commercial capabilities on orbit than there are military capabilities on orbit. So that dialogue of how we've operated for decades, since I've been a space operator for 30 plus years, how we operate every day, how does that translate into the commercial enterprise and how do they see that and their voice being heard and how that's established. As every domain, there's rules of the road and safety of flight or safety of traffic. How do you do that? And I think now that we stood up Department of Commerce and we're starting to see traction to get it stood up and the funding to get it stood up, I think that's important because they will then start to help normalize and establish some of those lanes in the road, space traffic management, safety of flight in the domain. And it will not be DoD led, it will be Department of Commerce led from the commercial side. So I think those are all important norms that every other domain has. It's just been because of the cost of entry and where we've been in space and the technology to where it's come today. It's now finally flipped that there's more in the domain than there are military or DoD assets. And now you're seeing that movement to norms, to traffic management, and for other work in the domain that needs to absolutely be done. And I think is critical work. We will definitely, as DoD, have a voice in those discussions, and we want to be a player because it is a team sport. But ultimately, it's got to become a norm of behavior for all, not just for some.
That's great. General Burt, we so appreciate your time and your insights and look forward to following you and your career and following up on these exciting topics. Colleen, back to you.
Thank you both for appearing on our show. What a great kickoff to our season on contested space. Be sure to check out the other shows as they were released, from Cyber to Workforce, from How Space Works to the Theory of War. There's more to come. You can browse all of our shows on our YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcasts, and all of our research and events are at csps.aerospace.org. A special thank you to James Liggins, our technical director, and to Max Siegel. Bye for now.